How a lie unraveled at a class reunion. A decade after the wreckage, she built a new life, only for him to try and burn it all down. But what he didn't count on was her strength and her new husband's arrival. For 10 years, Eleanor had been constructing a fortress, brick by painstaking brick, on the ruins that Kevin had left behind. But one night, at her high school reunion, he sought to demolish everything she'd built. Standing before their old friends, his voice dripping with false concern, he painted her as a failure, a fragile woman who had traded her ambition for an opulent but empty life. He believed he had her cornered, embarrassed, and broken. He thought no one would ever see the truth. What he never could have imagined was her new life and her new husband walking right through that door. The invitation had sat on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks, a stark, cream-colored rectangle, heavy with unspoken judgment. Millwood High class of 2014, 10-year reunion. Eleanor traced the embossed crest, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't the reunion itself that terrified her. It was him. Kevin. His name alone was a phantom limb, an ache in a part of her that was amputated, but never forgotten. Her husband, Daniel, walked into the kitchen, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm in her mind. He was a man carved from a different kind of stone than Kevin. Where Kevin was loud, brash ambition, Daniel was the quiet, unwavering force of a mountain. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle, his gaze perceptive. "You're thinking about it again," he said, his voice a low, reassuring murmur. It wasn't a question. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's ridiculous. Why do I still give him this power?" she confessed, her voice tight with frustration. "It's been 7 years since the divorce. Because wounds heal, Elle, but scars remain. He was your first everything. That kind of history doesn't just evaporate." Daniel's thumb drew a slow circle on her shoulder blade. He understood, more than anyone, the intricate web of her past. He knew the story Kevin told the world, the ambitious young lawyer and his sweet, supportive wife who couldn't keep up. But Daniel knew the truth, the constant belittling, the manipulation, the way Kevin had systematically dismantled her confidence until she felt like a ghost in her own life. "I don't want to go," she whispered, turning to face him. His eyes, the color of warm whiskey, held no judgment, only a deep, unshakable affection that, even after 4 years of marriage, sometimes felt too good to be true. "Then we won't," he said simply. That was Daniel's way. He never forced her. He offered her a refuge. It was that very quality that made her want to be stronger. "No, I have to. If I don't, he wins. He'll tell everyone I was too scared to show my face, that I'm hiding." She looked around their expansive apartment, a space of glass and steel overlooking the glittering lights of downtown Chicago. "He'll say I'm hiding in my golden cage." The phrase was a direct quote from Kevin's last venomous email, sent after he learned of her engagement to a man whose fortune dwarfed Kevin's wildest ambitions. Kevin had built a successful career as a high-profile lawyer, but Daniel Aguilar possessed the kind of generational wealth that made men like Kevin feel small, and Kevin hated feeling small. The night of the reunion arrived like a slow-motion storm. Eleanor stood before the full-length mirror in her walk-in closet, a space larger than her first apartment with Kevin. She wore a simple elegant sapphire blue dress that Daniel had chosen. It was understated, but the color made her blue eyes sparkle, and the cut hinted at the quiet strength she had built, both at the gym and within her soul. Over the past 4 years, with Daniel's silent support, She had rediscovered the woman Kevin had tried to erase. She had gone back to school, finishing the art history degree she had abandoned to support Kevin's legal career. She had founded a small but successful consulting firm, helping private collectors authenticate and curate their acquisitions. She was no longer just Kevin's ex-wife or Daniel's wife. She was Eleanor Davis, a respected, educated person in her own right. So why did she still feel like an imposter in her own skin tonight? "You look stunning," Daniel's voice from the doorway startled her. He leaned against the frame, already in his suit, a perfectly tailored masterpiece that made him look less like a businessman and more like a movie star. But his eyes weren't on the dress. They were on her face. "But you also look like you're about to face a firing squad." She managed a weak smile. "It feels the same." He came closer, his hands finding her waist. "He's going to try to get to you, Elle. He'll use our old friends as an audience. He'll play the victim, the magnanimous ex-husband who's just so worried about you." He mimicked Kevin's pompous tone perfectly. "He'll imply you sold out, that you're just a gold digger. He'll try to invalidate everything you've built." "I know," she said, her voice tight. "So what do you do?" Eleanor looked at her reflection. The fear was still there, a faint tremor behind her eyes. But underneath, something else was stirring, a flicker of defiance. The woman Kevin had married would have crumbled. The woman Daniel loved was made of stronger stuff. "I'm going to smile," her voice said, gaining strength. "I'm going to be polite, and under no circumstances will I let him see me bleed." Daniel's mouth curved into a proud smile. He was supposed to be at a charity gala tonight, a prior engagement he couldn't break. He would join her at the reunion later if he could get away. For the first few hours, she would be alone. It was a test, she knew. Her own personal Everest. As the car glided through the city streets, each mile brought her closer to the country club, the site of the reunion, and a decade back in time. She clutched her small evening bag, her knuckles white. This wasn't just about seeing Kevin. It was about facing the ghosts of who she used to be, and proving once and for all that the golden cage wasn't a prison, but a fortress she had helped build. And tonight, for the first time, she was ready to stand her ground. The country club was exactly as she remembered it, a brick monolith of old money and stifling tradition. The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the ghosts of teenage insecurities, now masked by expensive perfume, forced smiles, and the quiet hum of, "Who's more successful?" It was a symphony of nostalgia and regret, and a wave of it washed over Eleanor as she walked through the door. For a moment she was frozen, an easy target. Faces turned, whispers erupted like brush fires, and she could feel the collective weight of 10 years of gossip settle on her. "That's Eleanor, Mark's ex. You know who she's married to now?" Then a welcome, familiar voice cut through the noise. "Elle! Oh my God, you came!" Jessica, her best friend since high school, broke away from a small group and hugged her tight. Jess, now a witty pediatrician with 2 kids and a perpetually tired but happy glow, had been her rock during the divorce. She was one of the few who had seen the cracks in Kevin's perfect facade from the very beginning. "I almost didn't," Eleanor admitted, her voice strained. "Well, you look incredible, like you take no prisoners, a destroyer," Jess said, holding her at arm's length. "That color on you is a power play." Eleanor managed a genuine smile. "Is that my armor for the night?" "Good. You'll need it. The jackal is holding court at the bar." Eleanor's eyes instinctively followed Jess's gaze. And there he was. Kevin. He hadn't changed much physically. Still the same ash-blonde hair, the athletic build from his college football days, and the smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. He was surrounded by a captivated audience, old teammates, former cheerleaders, the people who had always orbited him. He gestured with a whiskey glass in his hand, his voice carrying across the room, full of the easy, practiced charm that had once captivated her. He hadn't seen her yet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Breathe, Elle. Just breathe. Come on," Jess said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a quieter corner. "Let's get a drink, and you can tell me all about this art business of yours. I need to live vicariously through someone who doesn't spend their days looking at pictures of rashes." For the next hour, Eleanor managed to exist in a carefully constructed bubble. She and Jess reconnected with some genuinely kind people from their past. The sweet, quiet Ben, now a successful app developer, and the soft-spoken artist Sarah, who owned a thriving floral design business. The conversations were light, safe. They talked about careers, families, the absurdity of getting older. Eleanor found herself slowly relaxing, the knot in her stomach loosening its death grip. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe he would just ignore her. It was a foolish hope. She saw the exact moment he noticed her. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes, the pale, cold blue she once thought was so beautiful, narrowed slightly. A predator sighting its prey. He excused himself from his group, his movements smooth and deliberate as he began to work his way through the crowd toward her. Jess squeezed her arm. "Showtime," she murmured under her breath. "Remember who you are?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders, her fingers tightening around the cool glass of her sparkling water. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. "Eleanor, I almost didn't recognize you," Kevin said, stopping in front of them. His voice was a silk sheath over a blade. His eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her body, from her designer heels to her simple pearl earrings, lingering for a moment on the sapphire and diamond ring Daniel had given her. It was a look designed to be both appreciative and derogatory, as if he were evaluating livestock. "You cleaned up nice." It was the same backhanded compliment he had used for years. "You look great tonight, Elle. It's amazing what a little effort can do." The old Eleanor would have blushed and stammered. The new Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. "Hello, Kevin. You haven't changed at all." She delivered the line with a cool, neutral tone, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. A flash of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it with his trademark charm. "Still the same old Kevin, working hard, fighting the good fight." He directed his smile at Jess. "Jess, so good to see you. How's the family?" He was playing the part of the kind, convivial guy, the bigger person. It was a calculated performance for the people who were now subtly watching their interaction. "We're great, Kevin," Jess replied, her tone clipped and cold. Kevin's attention snapped back to Eleanor. "So I hear congratulations are in order. You got yourself the big fish, Daniel Aguilar. That's impressive. Must be nice not to have to worry about anything anymore." The first shot had been fired. It was subtle, a carefully worded insinuation, lobbed in front of their peers. "You didn't earn your life. You married into it." "I'm very happy, Kevin," Eleanor said simply, refusing to take the bait. "Oh, I'm sure you are. It's a far cry from our little apartment, right?" He chuckled, a sound meant to be shared and nostalgic, but which had a sharp, bitter edge. "Remember how we used to count pennies just to get pizza on a Friday night? I guess you're eating off gold plates now, huh?" He was building his narrative, piece by piece. He was the common guy they all remembered, the one who had built his success from the ground up. She was the one who had taken a shortcut, who had abandoned their shared history for a life of unearned luxury. He was creating a power imbalance, casting himself as the relatable hero and her as the distant, unknowable elite. "I remember our history very well, Kevin," she said, her voice dropping a little, a hint of steel entering her tone. I remember all of it. His smile tightened. He knew she wasn't just talking about the pizza. She was talking about the nights she had stayed up, writing his briefs, the promising job in Tyrus she had turned down so she could support his dreams, the inheritance from her grandmother that had paid for his bar exams, an investment he had long forgotten to mention. He was about to retort when someone clapped him on the shoulder. It was Tom. The former quarterback and one of Kevin's closest acolytes. "Kevin, man, we're doing toasts. You've got to say a few words." Kevin's face lit up. An audience, a microphone. It was his natural habitat. He gave Eleanor one last condescending smile. "You'll have to excuse me. Some of us still have to network." He turned and walked toward the stage, leaving Eleanor standing in the silent, swirling wake of his arrival. Jess let out a low whistle. The narcissist has landed and is setting up for a public execution. Eleanor watched him ascend the stage, her blood turning to ice. This was worse than she had imagined. He wasn't just going to embarrass her in a private conversation. He was going to do it in front of everyone. The tinkling of a knife against a champagne flute cut through the murmur of the ballroom, a sharp, piercing sound that demanded attention. All heads turned toward the small, makeshift stage where Kevin stood, bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight. He held a microphone in one hand and his half-empty whiskey glass in the other, looking for all the world like a master of ceremonies. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked confident, charming, and utterly at ease. Eleanor knew better. She recognized the predatory gleam in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. This was Kevin in his element, a courtroom of his peers, and he was both the prosecutor and the star witness. "Hey everyone," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. A chorus of cheers and whistles answered him. "It's so good to see you all. 10 years. Can you believe it? Some of us look a little older." He paused for a laugh. "Some of us look a little richer." His eyes swept the room, pausing for a second on Eleanor. "And some of us are just happy to still be standing." He was a master of the insinuation. Every word was a carefully chosen pebble, tossed into the pond of public opinion to create ripples of speculation. Eleanor stood stiff, Jess's hand a warm, reassuring presence on her back. She could feel the curious stares of her classmates, their faces a mixture of intrigue and pity. "I look around this room and I see a lot of success stories," Kevin continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned sincerity. "Doctors, entrepreneurs, parents, people who've put in the grind to build something real, something they can be proud of." He took a sip of his whiskey, letting the statement hang in the air. The subtext was clear. Real success was earned through struggle, not through marriage. His gaze found Eleanor again, this time holding it. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "And I want to give a shout out to my ex-wife, Eleanor Davis." A murmur ran through the crowd. It was bold, even for Kevin. Calling her by her maiden name, doing it so publicly. It was a calculated move to strip her of her current identity and drag her back into a past that he controlled. "Some of you may not know, but Elle and I were high school sweethearts. We built a life together, from nothing." He shook his head, a sad, nostalgic smile on his lips. "I gave my career everything, built a future for us, and she was by my side for a while." The phrase, "for a while," was laced with a delicate poison. It suggested that she had abandoned the mission, that she lacked the fortitude to see the struggle through to the end. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears. He was rewriting her history in real time, painting himself as the hard-working, abandoned husband. "Life just takes you in different directions," he continued, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. Paths diverge, people change, and while my path was maybe a little steeper, a little harder, I wouldn't trade the struggle for anything. It forges character. It teaches you what's really important. He was spinning a web, and she was at the center of it. Every word was designed to diminish her, to frame her current happiness as shallow and unearned. He was tapping into the classic gold digger trope, a narrative as old as time and just as effective. He knew that in a room full of people who had spent the last decade climbing corporate ladders and paying off mortgages, his story of struggle would be far more relatable than her story of marrying a billionaire. A woman near them, whom Eleanor vaguely remembered as a cheerleader named Tiffany, whispered to her friend, loud enough to be heard, "Wow, I always wondered what happened with them." He seemed so broken up about it. Eleanor's stomach churned. It was working. He was casting his spell, and they were all falling for it. "But you know," Kevin said, leaning into the microphone, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost confessional tone. "Sometimes I worry about her. I really do." He looked directly at Eleanor now, his eyes filled with a theatrical concern that made her skin crawl. When you get handed everything on a silver platter, you can lose touch with reality. You can forget who you are, where you came from. You can forget the people who were there for you when you had nothing. This was the first direct stab. It wasn't a direct accusation, but an expression of concern. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, framing his cruelty as kindness. He wasn't attacking her. He was worried about her. He was the good guy, the caring ex-husband who only wanted the best for her. The silence in the room was deafening. They were all looking at her, waiting for her reaction. A tear, a denial, an outburst of anger. Any emotional response would be a win for him, proof that his words had hit their mark. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath. She remembered Daniel's words. "He'll try to invalidate everything you've built." She remembered her own promise. "I won't let him see me bleed." She lifted her chin slightly. She didn't break eye contact with Kevin, and she did something he didn't expect. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile or a happy one. It was small, serene, and utterly unreadable. It was the smile of a woman who knew a secret he couldn't possibly comprehend. Her lack of reaction seemed to throw him off balance. He had expected a crack in her composure, a sign of weakness he could exploit. He saw none. He faltered for a moment, his populist charm evaporating, revealing the raw animosity underneath. He quickly recovered, ending his toast with a flourish. "So, to the class of 2014, to the hard work, to the real success, and to never forgetting who you are." A smattering of applause broke the tension, but it was hesitant. Kevin had overplayed his hand just a little. The attack had been too personal, too direct. He had made people uncomfortable, but the damage was already done. Mark's toast had shifted the atmosphere of the room. It was as if he had pulled a thread that began to unravel the polite social fabric of the evening. The air, once filled with cheerful reminiscing, was now charged with the electrical hum of gossip. Eleanor felt like a specimen under glass, the object of 100 silent conversations. The whispers were everywhere, discreet but palpable. She could see them in the quick sideways glances, the heads bowed in conspiratorial huddles, the sudden silences that fell as she walked past a group. Jess, fiercely loyal, tried to intervene. "Don't listen to them, Elle. They're vultures. They feed on this stuff." But the judgments were impossible to ignore. They were subtle, delivered not in direct accusations, but in the careful wording of questions. "Eleanor, so good to see you. We were so surprised about you and Kevin. You guys seemed so perfect. And then, wow, Daniel Aguilar. What a whirlwind that must have been. The implication was clear. How did someone like you land someone like him so quickly? It's been a wonderful 4 years, Eleanor responded calmly, refusing to elaborate. Her brevity was a shield, but a woman she went to college with saw it as a challenge. I can imagine. I saw your picture in a magazine last winter from that hospital fundraiser. The Aguilar Foundation, right? It must be incredible to be a part of that. So different from, bake sales and parent-teacher meetings. It was a classic mean girl tactic, feigning admiration while simultaneously highlighting their perceived differences to create a sense of otherness. She was reminding everyone that Eleanor no longer belonged in their world. Before Eleanor could respond, a former friend of Kevin's came over, a beer in his hand and a smirk on his face. Davis, or Aguilar, I guess. Kevin was just telling us about the old days. Man, we were broke back then, but we had fun, didn't we? Nothing beats earning your first real paycheck, He clapped Kevin, who had conveniently reappeared, on the back. This guy's a monster in the courtroom. He built his firm from the ground up. You must be so proud of him. The question was a deliberate dart, designed to force her into an awkward position. If she agreed, she validated Kevin. If she didn't, she looked bitter. Kevin's ambition was always one of his defining qualities, she said, her voice a carefully polished surface. It was the truth, but stripped of any warmth. Kevin threw an arm around his friend's shoulders, playing the part of the magnanimous leader. Oh, that's ancient history, man. We've all moved on to bigger and better things. He looked at Eleanor. Some of us just had to climb a higher ladder to get there. The whispers grew louder, the judgments more pronounced. Every interaction was a tiny paper cut, insignificant on its own, but collectively, they were beginning to make her resolve bleed. Kevin had successfully poisoned the well, framed the narrative, and now his allies were reinforcing it. They saw him as the self-made man, the relatable guy from their shared past. They saw her as an outsider who had cashed in her ticket for an easy life. The most painful part was the silence of those who should have known better. People she had considered friends, people who had been to her and Kevin's first apartment, who had seen her working 2 jobs to support them while he was in law school, now stood on the sidelines, their faces averted, unwilling to challenge Kevin's version of events. Their silence was a form of complicity, a quiet endorsement of his cruelty. It fed into her deepest fear, that Kevin had always been right, that she was forgettable, insignificant, her contributions easily erased from the story. She retreated to a small, empty table in the corner, needing a moment to breathe. The ballroom felt as if it were closing in on her, the cheerful music a mocking counterpoint to the turmoil in her chest. She watched Kevin work the room, laughing, shaking hands, accepting back pats. He was glowing with the confidence of a victor. He wasn't just embarrassing her, he was gaining support, solidifying his social standing at her expense. This was his hidden motive, she realized. It wasn't just about hurting her, it was about power. In their small, shared world of Millwood High alumni, he was re-establishing his dominance. He was settling a score that had nothing to do with their marriage and everything to do with his own fragile ego, which had been wounded by the fact that she had married a man far more successful than he could ever hope to be. A figure approached her table, and she braced herself for another attack. But it was Ben, the quiet tech developer from earlier. He was holding 2 bottles of water and offered her one. "I figured you could use this," he said, his eyes kind. "He's being a real jerk." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, a sudden, sharp pang of gratitude. "Thanks, Ben. Don't mention it. I remember you helping me with my calculus homework in the library, even when you were swamped." You were always one of the good ones, Elle. His simple act of decency was a lifeline in a sea of judgment. It was a reminder that not everyone had bought into Kevin's lies. "He's telling everyone I'm some kind of kept woman," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ben snorted. Anyone who believes that is an idiot. Kevin was always a pro at making himself look good by making other people look bad. Some things never change. Their quiet conversation was a brief respite, but it was cut short by Kevin's voice once more. He was back on stage, a fresh drink in hand. "All right, everyone, settle down, he called out. "A few of us were just talking, and we thought it would be fun to share some stories of where you are now. But let's make it interesting. Let's talk about our biggest failure on the road to success, because that's where the real learning happens, right?" His eyes found Eleanor across the room, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He was upping the ante, preparing to land the final blow. He was going to turn her life into a cautionary tale. Kevin's new game was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. By framing it as a discussion about failure, he gave himself permission to be brutally personal under the guise of honest reflection. He began with a self-deprecating story about his first failed business, a high school lawn mowing enterprise that charmed the crowd and cemented his image as a humble, relatable guy. Then he passed the microphone to a few of his friends who shared sanitized anecdotes about bad investments or career mistakes, all with neat, happy endings. It was all a carefully constructed preamble, a warm-up for the main event. Eleanor watched, her dread mounting with each speaker. She knew the microphone was moving with a purpose, a weapon being passed from hand to hand until it reached its intended target. The room was a pressure cooker, and she was at its center. Finally, Kevin reclaimed the stage. "This has been great, guys. A real lesson in resilience." He paused, his expression shifting to one of deep, sad contemplation. "But it makes me think about a different kind of failure. Not a business failure, but a personal one." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze passing over Eleanor, as if he were just speaking to the room at large. But the focus of his energy was unmistakable. "You can have all the success in the world, but it doesn't mean much if you lose yourself along the way. I once knew someone who had so much potential, so much light. She was an artist. Brilliant. She could have done anything." Eleanor's breath hitched. He was talking about her. He was talking about the paintings she used to create, the passion she had poured onto canvases in the studio they once shared, a passion he had fostered at first, then slowly, methodically, extinguished with his criticism and indifference. "But she got scared," Kevin continued, his voice ringing with pity. "She let her fear of failure paralyze her. She gave up on her dreams. She chose the easy path, a comfortable life, a beautiful house, full, but at what cost? What happens when you trade your soul for security?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact narrative he had used to control her for years. He had convinced her that her art was a childish hobby, that her ambitions were unrealistic, and that her only real value was in being supportive. Now, he was presenting this distorted reality as a tragic story of her own making. He was erasing his role as the architect of her insecurity and reframing himself as the sorrowful witness to her downfall. He was unspooling her, thread by thread, in front of everyone they had ever known. "And the saddest part," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is I don't think she even realizes what she's lost. She's living in a beautiful golden cage, but she's forgotten how to fly." Finally, he directed his gaze directly at her, his eyes filled with a chilling mixture of pity and contempt. "I look at her now, and all I see is a ghost of the girl I used to know, and that, my friends, is a tragedy." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. He had done it. He had painted her as an empty shell, a failure not of career, but of character. A woman who had sold her very essence for a life of luxury. It was a perfect, damning portrait, and in the shocked, pitying faces of her classmates, she could see that they believed him. The carefully built walls of her composure began to crumble. The sapphire dress felt like a costume, her confidence a fragile mask. Underneath, she was that 24-year-old girl again, the one who looked in the mirror and only saw what Kevin told her was there. Not enough. Never enough. The room began to spin, the faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of judgment. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a roar in her ears. Gold digger. Failure. Empty. Ghost. Jess grabbed her hand, her knuckles white. Elle, breathe. He's lying. It's all a lie. But the lies were so potent because they were built around a kernel of her own buried fears. Had she taken the easy path? Was her life with Daniel, as wonderful and loving as it was, a beautiful distraction from her own abandoned potential? Kevin's poison was working because it was activating a poison she had been carrying inside herself for years. He had won. He had stripped her bare, exposed her deepest insecurities, and invalidated her entire existence in less than 5 minutes. He stepped off the stage without looking at her, his work complete. He was immediately surrounded by sympathetic friends who offered a comforting pat on the shoulder, their expressions confirming they saw him as the noble, wounded party. Eleanor felt a desperate urge to flee, to run from the room, from the pitying stares, from the suffocating weight of Kevin's narrative. She took a half step toward the exit, her vision narrowing, and then the double doors of the ballroom, at the far end of the room, burst open. A man walked in. He wasn't loud or ostentatious, but his presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. He was tall and impeccably dressed, but it was the aura of quiet, unshakable authority that commanded instant attention. He stood for a moment, his whiskey-colored eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, discerning intelligence. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, but the entire social ecosystem of the room seemed to shift and recalibrate around him. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They weren't filled with gossip and judgment, but with awe and disbelief. Oh my God, that's Daniel Aguilar. He saw her. Across the crowded room, his eyes met hers. The noise, the judgment, the crushing weight of Kevin's words, it all seemed to fade into the background. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His gaze was a lifeline, a silent promise. I'm here. He began to walk toward her, his pace unhurried and deliberate. The crowd parted for him, like the Red Sea. Kevin, in the middle of his circle of sympathizers, turned to see what had caused the commotion. His face, flushed with victory only moments ago, slackened. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, shocked pallor. The hunter had just realized that a far larger, more dangerous predator had entered his territory. Daniel's entrance wasn't an arrival, it was an event. He moved through the ballroom with an economy of motion that bespoke a man utterly comfortable in his own skin. A man for whom rooms like this were not a stage for performance, but simply a space to be occupied. The collective gaze of the Millwood High alumni followed him. A ripple of silent astonishment and frantic reevaluation spread through the crowd. This wasn't just a successful man. This was a different echelon of existence, a name they read in the Wall Street Journal, not the local paper. Kevin and his cronies were frozen mid-sentence, their bubble of self-satisfaction instantly popped. Kevin's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, disbelief, fury, and a sudden raw awareness of his own provincial status. He who had just spent the last hour meticulously crafting his image as the self-made king of his small pond was now face to face with an ocean. Daniel didn't even look in Kevin's direction. His attention was entirely on Eleanor. As he approached, he saw the tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the fragile way she was holding herself together. His expression, which had been neutral and observant, softened with a deep, protective tenderness that was for her alone. He reached her and, without a word, took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, a solid anchor in her sea of panic. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, a small, intimate gesture that was somehow more powerful and declarative in this public space than any grand pronouncement. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. The gala was endless. "Daniel," she breathed, his name a prayer of relief. "What are you doing here?" "You're my wife," he responded simply, as if that were the only explanation needed in the world. He turned his attention to Jess. "Jessica, it's good to see you." "You too, Daniel," Jess said, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. "Your timing is impeccable." Daniel's gaze finally drifted from Eleanor, sweeping the room. He saw the stunned faces, the awkward silence, and then, finally, he let his eyes settle on Kevin. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. He just looked at him. It was a calm, assessing gaze, the kind a geologist might give to a common rock. In that single dismissive look, he stripped Kevin of all his bluster and bravado, making him small and insignificant. Kevin, recovering some of his composure, puffed out his chest and took a step forward, forcing a boldness he clearly didn't feel. "Aguilar, I'm Kevin Ramos, Eleanor's ex-husband. We haven't been formally introduced." He held out his hand, a desperate attempt to assert some form of equality, to prove he belonged on the same level. Daniel looked at the offered hand for a long moment, not with contempt, but with a kind of distant curiosity. Then he looked back at Kevin's face, his expression unreadable. He made no move to shake it. "An introduction is not necessary," Daniel said, his voice quiet, but with an absolute clarity in the silent room. "I know who you are." The simple statement was devastating. It implied a history, a knowledge that went beyond a mere name. The hand Kevin had offered hung in the air for a painful second before he dropped it awkwardly to his side. A flush of anger and humiliation crept up his neck. Daniel turned his body slightly, creating a subtle but unmistakable barrier between Kevin and Eleanor. He had taken control of the space, of the entire dynamic. Without raising his voice or making a single threatening move, his power was not in what he did, but in what he didn't need to do. "I believe you were entertaining everyone with stories, were you not?" Daniel said, his eyes still on Kevin. "Something about failure?" Kevin swallowed hard. "Just old friends sharing stories. You know how it is?" "I'm not sure I do," Daniel replied, his tone still soft, almost conversational. "My wife is one of the most resilient, courageous people I have ever met. Her definition of success might differ from yours. You see, she measures it not by the noise you make, but by the quiet integrity with which you build a life. Not by the dreams you loudly proclaim, but by the ones you quietly, diligently achieve." Every word was a precise, surgical cut, dismantling the very foundation of the narrative Kevin had so carefully constructed. He wasn't just defending Eleanor, he was redefining the terms of the entire debate. Eleanor stared at him, her heart swelling with a feeling so immense she could barely contain it. He hadn't barged in with fists up. He hadn't made a scene. He was defending her with his intelligence, his dignity, and his unshakable belief in her. He was showing everyone in the room the man he was, and in doing so, he was showing them the woman he saw. When he looked at her, the onlookers were captivated. This was a far more compelling drama than Kevin's self-pitying monologue. It was a silent, deadly clash of two very different kinds of power. One was loud, insecure, and built on the subjugation of others. The other was quiet, absolute, and rooted in conviction. "I think," Daniel said, his gaze finally releasing Kevin and turning to the rest of the room, a hint of steel now underlying his calm tone, "that the game is over." Then he looked at Eleanor, his face softening once more. "Let's get some air." He didn't wait for a reply. Holding her hand firmly, he began to lead her away from the toxic epicenter of the room. The crowd parted for them once again. They walked past the stunned faces, the dropped jaws, the dawning realization in their classmates' eyes. As they reached the doors, Eleanor risked one last look back. Kevin was alone. His former audience had subtly drifted away, not wanting to be associated with the losing side. He looked deflated, his cheap victory having turned to ash in his mouth. For the first time all night, he looked exactly like what he was, a bully who had just been put in his place. What can we learn from Eleanor's story? The first thing is that a person's worth is not defined by their relationship with others, but by their own character and accomplishments. Kevin tried to diminish Eleanor by framing her success as a result of her marriage, but he failed to realize that her true strength came from within. The way she had built her business, returned to school, and fought to reclaim her own identity were all testaments to her resilience and drive. We also learn that our past does not have to dictate our future. Kevin's toxic behavior and constant emotional manipulation had a profound effect on Eleanor for years, but she eventually found the courage to break free and create a new life for herself. The journey was not easy, but it was necessary. Finally, we see that true power lies in quiet confidence and integrity, not in loud boasts or public shaming. Kevin's attempt to assert his dominance through a public display of narcissism backfired spectacularly when confronted with Daniel's unwavering support and calm authority. His lies were no match for the truth, and in the end, his own insecurities were laid bare for all to see. If this story of betrayal, redemption, and the incredible power of personal worth resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more uplifting stories that feel like real life. Your support is my motivation.